Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, good morning, everybody. Today we'll be taking Sutta number 89 in the Majjhima Nikāya. This is called the Dhammacetiya Sutta, which is translated as monuments to the Dhamma. And then behind the sutta, indicated by the commentary, is an important historical event taking place in the ancient history of ancient India. Okay, this sutta takes the form of a conversation between King Pasenadi of Kosala and the Buddha. Kosala was the state in which the city of Savatthi was located, and the Buddha's main monastery, Jeta's Grove, was located in the city of Savatthi. And so King Pasenadi had been sort of the patron of the Buddha during most of his teaching career. And the first time that King Pasenadi was exposed to the Buddha's teaching was in the sutta that we examined 2 weeks ago. This is the Piyajattika Sutta, Sutta number 87 in the Majjhima Nikāya. And if you remember, in that sutta, when King Pasenadi first heard a statement reportedly coming from the Buddha that sorrow and suffering arise from those who are dear, he became angry and upset with that saying, and he dismissed his wife, Queen Malika, for her devotion to the Buddha and for her acceptance of that saying. But then, by a kind of ruse, Queen Malika got King Pasenadi to agree with the principle expressed in that saying of the Buddha. And then when Queen Malika pointed out to the king that was the very same statement that the Buddha was making, then King Pasenadi got down on the ground and he extended his hands in homage and he said, Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Then, as I explained last time, it seems at that point King Pasenadi had not yet actually met the Buddha in person, but his first encounter with the Buddha is recorded in Samyutta Nikāya, chapter 3, sutta number 1, where King Pasenadi came to the Buddha and said, "Do you claim to be a fully enlightened one?" And the Buddha said, "I do." Then King Pasenadi said, "How can you claim to be fully enlightened when you're so young? You're just, probably at that time the Buddha might have been 36, 37 years old, probably shortly after his enlightenment." And the king, normally we would expect somebody who's claiming to be enlightened to have a long gray beard and long gray hair, to be walking with a walking stick. And here it's like, is there anybody here in their middle 30s? How old are you?
34.
How old?
34.
So you're 34. Okay, so give or take a few years, so suppose you're 36, 37. And you came up to me and you said, I'm fully enlightened one. And I, in my late 60s, would look at this, kid and say, he's claiming to be fully enlightened? No way. So King Pasenadi, at that time, we'll see that he's actually the same age of as the Buddha, but he would expect somebody who's fully enlightened to be, considerably older than himself. So he says, how could you claim at such a young age to be fully enlightened? Then the Buddha explained to him that there are 4 things that one shouldn't disparage just because they're young. One is a fire, because the fire could flare up and burn down even the whole village or town. One is a prince who's young, because that prince, if you disparage him, he might be the heir to the throne. So when he becomes king, he'll remember that one disparaged me when I was young. Throw him in prison, torture him, execute him. Don't worry, I'm not going to do that to you. And you're not even making any claims. Okay, the third thing is a snake. If one disparages a little young snake, a viper, then I think that there was a belief in India that snakes will remember what is said, will find out what is said about them. So if one disparages a little snake, a poisonous snake, when that snake grows up and becomes big, he'll try to seek you out and bite you. And then the fourth thing that one shouldn't disparage when they're young is an ascetic, a samana. Because if one disparages the samana, of course he's not going to intentionally do anything harmful to oneself, but by disparaging a samana, if he happens to be a holy one who's reached one of the stages of awakening, then one generates a heavy type of unwholesome karma which can come back and cause painful consequences for oneself. Okay, so at that point, when the Buddha gave that explanation and then recited the verses, then King Pasenadi gained faith in the Buddha, and he went for refuge. He took the 3 refuges. So from that time on, King Pasenadi frequently would come to see the Buddha when the Buddha was living in Savatthi, and they developed a very close relationship. There's no report that King Pasenadi achieved any of the 4 stages of awakening, not even the stage of stream entry. But still, King Pasenadi was a very devout follower of the Buddha, very generous supporter, and he frequently came to see the Buddha to get advice from the Buddha, to get consolation from the Buddha. Even one time, the Buddha gave King Pasenadi some advice. It seems that the king was overeating, and so he gained a lot of weight. And so when he came to see the Buddha, even though he had to walk a short distance, he was huffing and puffing and out of breath. And so the Buddha gave him some advice on how to lose weight. Yeah, very practical advice. He told him that he should charge one of his attendants with the responsibility when the king is taking his meal. You see, the king was eating, I think the Buddha asked the king, how much rice are you eating? And the king, he expressed this in terms of the Indian measurements of the period. It would be something like eating a pot of rice. And so the Buddha said, Your Majesty, you have to stop that. You have to reduce the amount of rice you're eating. But the Buddha gave wise advice. He said, don't try to do it suddenly. If you just cut down from a pot of rice to just like a bowl of rice, you won't be able to do it. You're going to get hungry, and then before long, you go off the wagon again? Is that the expression? When somebody's trying to stop drinking, you go off the wagon, and then again you're eating a pot of rice. So rather what the Buddha said is that you tell your attendant, as you're eating your pot of rice, first, when you've eaten 3/4 of the pot, he should come, give you a bowl of water, and take the pot of rice away. Then after you get used to 3/4 of the pot, the attendant should serve you just half a pot of rice. Okay, when you've gotten used to half a pot of rice, then the attendant will come and take the rice away when you've eaten 1/3 of the pot of rice. Then the next time when you've eaten 1/4 of the pot of rice, then the next time he doesn't have to serve you the pot of rice, but he can just put the rice in a bowl, and then you'll be able to eat it, and you'll be accustomed to it. Okay, so that's the Buddha's advice on losing weight. This also comes in the Samyutta Nikāya. It's in chapter 3. Anybody who wants to lose weight, I don't remember the number of the sutta, but I think it's called, the name of the sutta is something like a pot of rice. There's only 25 short suttas in chapter 3, so you could find it easily. If anybody is too thin and wants to gain weight, you might start from a normal-sized bowl of rice and work your way up, maybe to 1/3 of a pot. Okay, now this sutta that we're going to take today, this was a conversation between King Pasenadi and the Buddha that takes place when both of them are 80 years old. And we know the Buddha passed away at the age of 80, and we'll see, at least from the notes that are taken from the commentary, that this is actually, though he doesn't know it at the time, this is the last time King Pasenadi is going to meet the Buddha. His last conversation with the Buddha. Okay, so when the sutta opens, the Buddha is living in the Sakyan country at a town of the Sakyans called Medalumpa. Otherwise, it's not mentioned anywhere else that I could think of. And now the Sakyan state was a republic. It was located, as you probably know, in what is now part of Nepal, perhaps part of it overlaps India. It's in the foothills of the Himalayas. Or actually, it's not really the foothills of the Himalayas. We say it's at the foot of the Himalayan mountains, but it's still the plain area. And though the Sakyan state was self-administering, a republic, but still there was a kind of protectorate of the kingdom of Kosala. And so King Pasenadi exercised some kind of sovereignty over the Sakyan state, though he didn't directly administer it. It was administered, the Sakyan state was administered by a council of the senior Sakyans. And it seems that in earlier years, the Buddha's father, who's usually said to have been a king, was actually probably the leading elder of the Council of Elders of the Sakyan Republic. Okay, so when the sutta begins, King Pasenadi had arrived at Nagarika for some business or other. Okay, and then he addressed his, I guess this was his chief minister, like his Secretary of State, named Dec-1-2012 and asked him to go to get the carriages prepared. He wants to go to one of the pleasure gardens to see a pleasing spot. Okay, so Karayana prepares the carriages and they go out from Nagarika and they reach a park. This would be like a pleasure garden. And as the king is walking around in this park, he sees the roots of trees, which are said to be lovely and inspiring, quiet, undisturbed by voices, with the atmosphere of seclusion, remote from people, favorable for retreat or for seclusion. And then as he sees this reminds him of the Buddha. And so he reports this to his minister, Karayana, and he asks him, where is the Buddha now living? And so King Dec-1-2012 reports to the king that the Buddha is now living at the Sakyan town named Medalumpa. How Dec-1-2012 knows this, I don't know, but there must have been some kind of grapevine of information that he was in on. So we asked, how far is it to Medalumpa? And Karayana replies that it's 3 yojanas. The yojana is said to be somewhere around 6 or 7 miles. So this would be roughly, it could be 20 miles away. And so now, since King Pasenadi is he's full of this sort of inspired recollection of the Buddha, and he's full of a yearning to see the Buddha, like he hasn't seen the Buddha maybe for several months. And so he says, let's go to Medalumpa and see the Buddha. Okay, so they get the carriages prepared and they set out together from Nagaraka towards Medalumpa. Okay, and then apparently out on the outskirts of Medalumpa there must be some sort of vihara or arama, some monastery where the Buddha is living. And so the king gets out from his carriage and he starts proceeding towards this park, and he arrives there while it's still daylight. And then he sees a number of monks walking up and down in the open, and he goes to them and he asks, where is the Buddha living now? I want to see the Blessed One. Then one of the monks points out his kuti, his dwelling place. Actually, it's probably more than a kuti, it's a cottage, probably a little cottage. And the monk tells him that's his dwelling place. And if you want to see him, you can go up to it quietly, enter the porch, clear your throat. That's a way of signaling that a person is present. And then tap on the panel, and then the Buddha will open the door to you. Okay, now here's a very significant sentence that is a key to the underlying, sort of the dramatic story that implicitly underlies this sutta. Now when King Pasenadi wants to see the Buddha, he can't be wearing the emblems of royalty, because that would be a kind of display of royal arrogance. And in fact, there's a rule that for the monks, that if a monk is going to preach the Dhamma, the person who's listening shouldn't have a weapon on him and shouldn't be wearing a hat. That's because the hats in ancient India, it wasn't something that we wear here, like these kind of caps to keep warm, but it's usually worn, a hat, as a kind of mark of prestige. So it's a show of person's high position, that he's wearing a particular kind of hat. And so the king hands over his sword and turban to his minister, Karayana. And what's significant is that the sword and turban are emblems of royalty. Okay, now, as King Pasenadi goes in to see the Buddha, Karayana thinks to himself, the king is now going into a secret session with the Buddha, and I have to wait here alone. Okay, just as we read those sentences, they might not seem very significant, but as I said, there is an underlying story to this, which is related in a number of commentaries. Okay, now Karayana, who is the minister of King Pasenadi, was the nephew of a man named Bandula. Okay, now Bandula was a chieftain of the people who are called the Malans. And the Mala state, it's a small state in the northeast of India. This edition had a map. Yeah, this edition does have a map. Let's see if the Mala state, yeah. The map is on page 76. You could see the Buddha's own state. The second state is to the north of the Malan state. And Kusinara, the town of Kusinara, where the Buddha passed away, is in the Malan state. And both of them are adjacent to the larger, more powerful state of Kosala. And so at the time that the Buddha lived, these large and powerful monarchies were emerging. The two main monarchies in the northeast of India were the state of Kosala and the state of Magadha. The king of Magadha, the first king, powerful king, was Bimbisara, and he was actually murdered by his son Ajatasattu, who then became the king in the later part of the Buddha's life. And the king of Kosala was King Pasenadi, and Kosala had been absorbing or exercising some kind of sovereignty or protectorship over the Sakyan Republic and the Republic of the Malans. Okay, now Bandula apparently had been the kind of trusted administrator of King Pasenadi. He was a chieftain of the Malans, and apparently King Pasenadi was very fond of him and had a great deal of trust in him. But some of the ministers of King Pasenadi who were close to him were jealous of Bandula. And so what they did was to conspire to poison King Pasenadi's mind to make him suspicious of Bandula. And so, you know the way people can spread rumors. Like on one occasion, one minister would go to the king and tell him, Bandula has been up to this and that. On another occasion, another minister would come and say, I heard Bandula talking to some of his own people and they're plotting to break away from you. And then another would come and say, recently I got some word from so-and-so that Bandula is planning to revolt against you. And another one would say, I heard Bandula is planning to have you assassinated. And so when King Pasenadi heard this coming from different people, he thought, it's either me or Bandula, and it ain't going to be me. And so he arranged to murder Bandula and a number of, I think they were nephews of Bandula. I forgot the exact number. Yeah, he had Bandula killed together with his 32 sons. Okay, now Dec-1-2012 was a nephew of Bandula. And he had resentment against King Pasenadi for killing his uncle and so many of his cousins. It seems a little strange that King Pasenadi would appoint as a minister the nephew of somebody that he's killed, but perhaps the king didn't know of their relationship. Or perhaps he thought Karayana was trustworthy. Actually, Karayana was the commander-in-chief of the king's army. He was the Senapati, like the general in charge of the army. And so now when King Pasenadi went to see the Buddha, according to the commentary, Karayana was afraid that the king was going to plot with the Buddha, form a plot with the Buddha to have himself killed. Maybe he was afraid the Buddha is going to tell the king, your commander-in-chief is the nephew of Bandula, he's not trustworthy, get him killed. And so Karayana became afraid. Especially he was waiting here alone, and maybe he thinks King Pasenadi is going to come out, and then he's going to ask for his sword back, and then he's going to kill me. And so, according to the commentary, what Karayana did was to hand over the crown, or the turban, and the sword to King Pasenadi's son, who was a general named Vidutava. And by doing this, what he is doing in effect is handing over the emblems of sovereignty to the king's son, to the prince, making the prince the king in his place. I think according to the commentary, Karayana set off to go back to the city of Savatthi and gave those emblems to Vidutava and had him crowned king in Pasenadi's absence. The king's son is named Vidutava, rather strange name. And you know, in India, at least in ancient India, kings would always want to beget sons in order to have heirs to the throne. But so often it happened in Indian history that the son who was the heir to the throne would usurp the throne from his father and have his father imprisoned or killed. This happened in the state of Magadha when Prince Ajatasattu overthrew his father, the very pious King Bimbisara, had him imprisoned and killed. And Vidutaba is going to take over the kingdom from his father, King Pasenadi, and lock the gates to the city so Pasenadi won't be able to enter again. Okay, so at this point, it seems Karayana leaves the scene and goes back to Savatthi to hand the emblems of royalty over to the Prince Vidutaba. Okay, so while this act of treachery, of treason is going on, King Pasenadi goes up to the dwelling of the Buddha, taps on the door, and then the Buddha opens the door. And then King Pasenadi enters the dwelling, and now he prostrates himself with his head at the Buddha's feet. This is the usual sign of respect. But this time he goes even further, and he covers the Buddha's feet with kisses and caresses them with his hands, and he declares out loud, "I am King Pasenadi of Kosala. I am King Pasenadi of Kosala." This is a kind of act, I guess, in the culture of that period. It signifies, it shows complete humility, complete surrender to a spiritual teacher. And then the Buddha asked the king, "What is your reason for showing such homage, supreme homage, to this body, and for showing such friendship?" You would see that the Buddha is somewhat detached from that act of homage and humility. So he says it's something that's done to this body. Okay, and now King Pasenadi is going to praise the Buddha in terms of 10 qualities that he can observe in the Buddha and in the Sangha. So he declares out loud first, he expresses his faith that the Buddha is, or the Blessed One is fully enlightened, the Dharma is well proclaimed by the Blessed One, and the Sangha of the Buddha's disciples is practicing the good way. Okay, so this is his statement of faith, his statement of confidence. And now he's going to give 10 reasons for this confidence, for facts, for observations that he's made on the basis of which he is able to declare his trust, such trust in the three jewels. Okay, I have to put on my reading glasses. Okay, he says, the first one, he says, "Now, Venerable Sir, I see some ascetics and Brahmins leading what is called a limited holy life for 10 years, 20, 30, 40 years. And then on a later occasion, I see them well-groomed and well-anointed. Now they've grown their hair, or if they had the long hair, they've had it trimmed neatly. And if they were shaving the face, now they've grown beards. They would be well-groomed beards. And they're enjoying themselves, provided and endowed with the 5 objects of sensual pleasure. In other words, even though they've lived the ascetic life even for as long as 40 years, so assuming that they've entered the ascetic life at the age of 20, now they're 60 years old, so now they might have been going around with loincloths and with long matted hair and beards and practicing austerities, wandering over the country all alone or in small groups, fasting, sleeping out in the open on cold nights. Now at the age of 60, they're going out to high-class restaurants. They have their iPad, and maybe they're holding hands with their girlfriend or with their wife, and wearing, what are some of them?
Giorgio
Armani. The finest Italian suits. Okay, but he says, here I see the bhikkhus leading the perfect and pure holy life as long as their life and breath lasts. And so therefore he says, indeed, I do not see any other spiritual life elsewhere as perfect and pure as this. And it's a very beautiful testament of praise on the part of King Pasenadi. But as one who's lived as a monk some 20 years in Sri Lanka, I have to say, wait a minute, King Pasenadi. Hold your horses. I know a few things that you don't know. But I haven't even lived in Thailand. But even on the basis of the suttas themselves, there's a sutta we would have taken maybe a few months ago. Let's see, it's number 77. I'll get the page number in a moment. It's page 631. It's actually on the top of 632. Here it's the wanderer named Sakaludai who is praising the Buddha, and he says, even those disciples of his who fall out with their companions in the holy life and abandon the training to return to what's called the low life, or this is the household life, even they continue to praise the Master, it's the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, and then they blame themselves for giving up the monastic life. And they say that we were unlucky, we had little merit, it's our own fault that we couldn't continue to live this excellent holy life. And then they become monastery attendants or lay followers, and they observe the 5 precepts. So we find from this sutta that there's evidence that some of the Buddha's monastic disciples would give up the training and return to lay life. But there's also evidence in the suttas that some of the disciples who left the Buddha, the monastic disciples who gave up the monastic life, didn't always praise the Buddha. For example, Sutta number 12, which I think we took a long time ago, is the case of a man named Sunakata. This is on page 164, who had been a monk under the Buddha. Then he always wanted the Buddha to perform what we would call miracles, feats of supernatural power. And the Buddha refused to perform feats of supernatural power just to please the curiosity of this insistent disciple. And so Sunakata kept on getting angrier with the Buddha, getting upset with him. Why doesn't the Buddha perform a feat of supernatural power? Probably he's just an ordinary person. He doesn't have any realization. Then he gave up the monastic life, and then he went around. He was from the city of Vaisali, and so he went around in the city of Vaisali saying, on page 164, paragraph 2, the ascetic Gautama doesn't have any kind of superhuman states, any excellent knowledge and vision. He teaches a Dhamma which he has just worked out through his own reasoning, following his own line of inquiry. And the most it will do is to lead one who practices it to complete destruction of suffering, but not to any kind of supernatural powers. Okay, so even during the Buddha's lifetime, this is just one example, but there are several examples of disciples who left the Buddha and then complained about him and belittled him afterwards. And so King Pasenadi is speaking a little bit let's say, beyond his experience here. But perhaps we could say that the king would have observed that there were many distinguished people who became disciples under the Buddha, and continue to live the monastic life through their entire life. Okay, so he says that this is one reason why I infer, according to Dhamma, or I infer reasonably, that the Buddha is perfectly enlightened, the Dhamma is well proclaimed, the Sangha is practicing the good path. Okay, then the king says the next ground for his confidence, he sees kings quarrel with kings, nobles quarrel with nobles, this is Kshatriyas with Kshatriyas, Brahmins with Brahmins, householders with householders, mother with son, father with son, brother with brother, sister with brother, friend with friend. Okay, so he sees in the ordinary society conflicts, even within a family. But he says, here I see the monks living in concord with mutual appreciation, without disputes, blending like milk and water, viewing each other with kindly eyes, and I don't see any other assembly elsewhere with such harmony. So that, he says, that is my second reason for uttering such praise of the Buddha. Again, I have to say, wait a second, Your Majesty. Aren't you familiar with the famous story of the great dispute at Kosambi? We came across that, again, it must have been several months ago. Sutta number 48 in the Majjhima Nikāya. Okay, this is page 419. Okay, on the occasion, the Buddha was living at Kosambi in Gosita's park. Now, on that occasion, the monks at Kosambi had taken to quarreling and brawling and were deep in disputes, stabbing each other with verbal daggers. They couldn't convince one another, they couldn't persuade one another. Okay, so they complains. One monk goes to the Buddha, complains. The Buddha tries to reconcile them. here it seems the Buddha gives them some instructions to re-establish harmony. But there's another Sutta, 128, I believe. This is again referring to the quarrel at Kosambi where the monks are deep in dispute. Then the Buddha comes to them and tries to reconcile them. And the monks who are fighting with each other tell the Buddha, in fact they say, "Listen, Master, you go back to your hut and you sit there and you meditate peacefully. This is our business. We're going to settle this ourselves." And then the Buddha gets so disappointed by the monks that he takes his bowl and robe. He utters some voices saying how these monks have now become fools. And then the Buddha goes off, wanders and goes off to live someplace quietly by himself. Okay, so, and then if you read the Vinaya Pitaka, you see that, that there are quite a few occasions where the monks fight with each other, and so the Buddha had to set up guidelines to prevent disputes within the Sangha and principles of harmony and respect, so the monks would live together harmoniously. And I'm not making this up, and I'm not drawing upon the Jain scriptures or the Brahmanic texts. This is what the Buddhist texts themselves say about conditions in the Sangha during the Buddha's time. Okay, but we could say generally, and let us say this is the Buddha's time. Afterwards, we have numbers of sects in Buddhism. I mean, not to speak of the divide of the early Sangha into 18 sects. Then there came a big division between the followers of the early Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism, the number of sects in Mahayana Buddhism, then even in Theravada Buddhism, there are divisions into a number of, within Sri Lanka, to 3 or 4 sects or lineages, generally because of very minor points in the Vinaya, or places of ordination, the origin of ordination. Okay, the third point. Okay, the king says, this is paragraph 12, "I have walked and wandered from park to park, from garden to garden." He's actually not referring to like flower gardens, but what's meant here are the kind of places that were set aside in India, outside the towns and villages, where the wandering sadhus, the monks, the ascetics, the renunciants, the sannyasis would go to stay as they're traveling around the country. And he says, "There I have seen some recluses and Brahmins who are lean, wretched, unsightly, jaundiced, with veins standing out on their limbs, such that people wouldn't want to look at them again." Has anybody been to India and seen some of the ascetics in the towns of India? You've been? And seen the ascetics? You see many of them, they undertake extreme fast, and so the body's very, very thin. And if you've seen the Shaivite ascetics, they're not thin, they're very powerful, very strong, very powerful, and they go naked, else they wear just the loincloth, and they have, the Shaivite marking, I think it's the lines that go horizontally on the forehead. Excuse me?
Yeah, they're usually white.
Yeah, that's the Shaivites are horizontal, the Vaishnavites, devotees of Vishnu, have something like this, I think, on the forehead. And then the Shaivites, at least some of the sects, they carry this they call it the trident. It's like a pitchfork with 3 points on it. And they travel in troops and groups. And if you see them, pretty scary. I haven't seen, though I've been in India, I don't think I've seen them in real life, but I've seen photographs of them. If I remember, there was a photographic book It's probably still available. I think it's called Sadhus. It's photographs of the different types of ascetics in India. And you see some of the ascetics, they sit on these seats made out of spikes, and other ascetics take the vow always to keep one leg lifted, so they hang on to the branch of a tree, keeping one leg up in the air till, the blood, it seems that something happens to the circulation, so the body starts to turn a kind of yellowish color or sometimes a bluish color. And so I say that there's a real difference in appearance. And I've seen the Jain ascetics in India. When this was 1975, and I went on pilgrimage to India, and I was in, it was Rajagaha. Yeah, Rajagaha, there was a Jain festival. And this was, there were two sects of Jains. One is called Saitambara, which means the white-clothed or white-robed Jains. They wear robes, the white color robe. And then the other sect is called Dicambara, which means those who wear the sky as their robe. And that means the naked Jains. And this was an annual festival of the naked Jain ascetics. And so they had traveled, many of them had traveled from different parts of India to converge upon Rajgir, even traveling, I think, from Gujarat, where the Jains are quite numerous. And so there was a group of them, completely naked, and it was really cold. It was this was early November. It was about, outside, we were wearing sweaters, if I remember. Or at least we were wearing the pullovers. So it could have been about 60. For India, that's pretty cool. Maybe 55 and 60. And all of these Jain ascetics gather in this Jain temple. I had met up with a group of Thai monks, and we had gone to see the festival. The Thai monks are there with their cameras taking pictures. And they were talking with the Jain lay supporters and a little bit with myself. But the Jain ascetics were there right in the middle, very strict and stringent in their observances. I think the Jain lay devotees were looking upon us, the Buddhist monks, like we were just lay people wearing a particular colored robe. Okay, but now the king sees the Buddhist monks, he says, he says, "Here I see the monks smiling and cheerful, sincerely joyful, plainly delighting, their faculties fresh, living at ease, unruffled, subsisting on what others give, abiding with mind like a wild deer's. And I have thought, surely these venerable ones perceive," he uses, this is a peculiar idiom of the text, "successive states of lofty distinction." It means that they've attained different stages of, success of meditative attainments or stages of realizations with wisdom. And so for that reason, they are so smiling, so joyful, so cheerful, and so on. And in my experience, I'd say that there's some basis for this king's statement, since I've seen when there are groups of monks who are really practicing quite earnestly, then, sometimes if you see the photographs of monks from Sri Lanka or Burma, there's a thing that when you take a monastic photograph, The monk is always supposed to look as grim as if his mother had died the day before. So I've seen like the photographs of monks looking something like this. If you look up some of the writings of the Burmese, the great Buddha, Burmese master Lady Soyador, Achan Munya, Mahasi Soyador, U Pandita Soyador. But when you see them in real life, outside of the photograph situation, they're quite smiling and friendly. I can't speak about Lady Soyador and Achan Mun because they passed away and I never met them. I never met U Pandita Soyador, but I've seen other photographs of him where he's in a real life situation, not posing, and he's smiling. But this is from my own experience that when there are groups of monks who are practicing seriously, sincerely, and you get them in a natural situation and they're quite smiling and cheerful and open. But when they're giving lectures too. Okay, that's 1, 2, 3. Okay, the fourth reason is, the king says that, I'm a head-anointed Kshatriya king, and I have the power to execute anybody that I want, to fine anybody that I want, to exile anybody that I want. Yet, when I'm sitting in council, some of the ministers in the council might break in and interrupt me, and then I have to plead with them, please, when I'm speaking, don't interrupt. But he says that here I see that when the Buddha is teaching the Dhamma, even to hundreds of people, there's not even the sound of one disciple coughing or clearing his throat. And then he gives an example. One time when the Buddha was teaching, one of the people in the audience cleared his throat. It must have been a monk, because then it says, then one of his companions in the holy life nudged him and said, "Be quiet, Venerable Sir, don't make any noise. The Blessed One is teaching the Dhamma." Okay, so then the king thought it's wonderful that the assembly can be so well disciplined, even though there's no threat hanging over their head. So this is another reason for his confidence in the Buddha. Okay, the next few reasons actually all go together as part of a set, that he sees some learned nobles, Kshatriyas, who are very clever in debate, and they hear that the Buddha is coming to their town or village, and so they make a determination that they're going to ask the Buddha some tricky questions, put him into a corner, and beat him in debate, humiliate him, embarrass him, and make him and refute his doctrine through their arguments and tough questions. But then the Buddha actually comes to their town or village, sets up to give a discourse, and then the people, these debaters, these learned Kshatriyas, when they hear the discourse, they become convinced by the Buddha's teaching, and so they don't even ask their question, but instead they give up their plan to humiliate him, and they proclaim themselves followers of the Buddha. They actually become his disciples. So this is stated with regard to first the Kshatriyas, then it's stated with regard to the Brahmins, then it's stated with regard to learned householders who are not Kshatriyas or Brahmins. And then it's repeated again for samanas, for ascetics, wandering ascetics. And not only do they become convinced by the Buddha's teaching and give up their questions and their strategy of embarrassing the Buddha, but they actually go forth from that. They ask the Buddha for permission to go forth into the homeless life, and then they go off by themselves to practice, and then they become arahants. Okay, so for this reason, this is a ground for the king's confidence in the truth of the Buddha's teaching. Okay. The next reason, the king refers to two of his, here they're called inspectors, or they might be called chamberlains, like his personal attendants. They're mentioned a number of places in the Pali Suttas. Isidatta and Purana. It seems that they were related in some way. I think they might have been brothers or cousins. And they were the personal attendants of the king. And the king says that they eat the food that I provide them. I give them carriages to use. Their livelihood depends on me, and they have a good reputation because of me. And yet, despite this, they honor the Blessed One, the Buddha, even more than they honor me. Then he mentions one occasion when he was traveling together with the army, and he put up in cramped quarters with these two attendants. And then during the night, the two attendants, Isidatta and Purana, spent much of the night talking on the Dhamma, even while the king probably had just crouched on the ground, wanting to sleep. And then they lay down with their heads in the direction of where the Buddha was staying, and with their feet pointed at the king. Yeah, and if you know anything about Indian society, Indian etiquette, that's considered not only impolite, but it's almost, say, audacious or almost provocative. You know, even if one person points his feet to another, it's showing disrespect to that person. And if you're pointing your feet at the king, it's very risky, disrespectful and risky. Because the king, if he gets angry at you, he'll say, away with you, maybe punish the person. Okay, so he says, this is also a reason why did I infer that the Buddha is enlightened, the Dhamma is well proclaimed, and so on. Apparently the king must have had high regard for Isidatta and Purana, because he didn't punish them, but instead he must have taken that the way they showed respect to the Buddha to be a sign that they understood the virtues of the Buddha even more deeply than he himself did. Okay, then he comes to the last reason why he praises the Buddha. But why he shows, this is not the reason for his inference. He doesn't say, this is why I think the Buddha is enlightened and why the Dhamma is well proclaimed. But this is a reason why he's showing such deep homage to the Buddha and showing such friendship to the Buddha. He says, again, Venerable Sir, the Blessed One is a noble. He's from the Kshatriya class. And I too am a Kshatriya. because the kings were Kshatriyas. The Blessed One is a Kosalan, and I am a Kosalan. Now, if I was the Buddha, maybe I would say here, wait a minute, king. Because as I explained earlier, the Buddha considered himself to be a Sakya, and his clan, his state was the Sakyan Republic. But from the standpoint of the Sakyans, they were an independent state, self-governing state. But because Kosala, the state of Kosala, had sort of annexed the Sakyan state as a protectorate, they considered the Sakyans to be Kosalans. And so the king is speaking from his point of view, not from the point of view of the Sakyans, he says, when he says that the Buddha is a Kosalan. And then he says, the Blessed One is 80 years old, and I too am 80 years old. So you see, we know that the Buddha lived to the age of 80, and so this will be in the last year of the Buddha's life. Okay, and so he says, since this is the case, it's proper for me to show such supreme honor to the Blessed One and to show such friendship. Okay, then after saying this, he says to the Buddha, I'm a king, I'm busy, I have a lot of work to take care of, and so I have to leave now. And so the Buddha tells him he can leave. And so then King Pasenadi, again, he gets up from his seat, again he pays homage to the Buddha, and then he departs. And the commentary tells us that what happened to the king after he departed, he went back to the spot where he had left Karayana, his commander-in-chief. And when he got there, Karayana wasn't there. Instead, he found an old servant woman had been left there in his place, and the servant woman told him that Karayana had taken the turban and the sword and had gone back to Savatthi. And so the king must have been suspicious of what's going on, and he must have had an inkling that now Karayana is going to hand the emblems of sovereignty over to my over-ambitious son, and now Vidutapa, the son, is going to usurp the kingship from myself. And so King Pasenadi, instead of trying to go back to Savatthi, he realized that even for him to try to go back there, it would be dangerous. He thought he would go to his nephew and son-in-law, King Ajatasattu of Magadha. And so he left, apparently by foot, traveling a long distance to Magadha. And when he arrived at Magadha, at Rajagaha, the capital of Magadha, it was late at night, and the gates of the city were all closed. And so the king was very tired from that long journey, quite long for an 80-year-old man who's not used to exercise. And so he had to lay down at night to sleep outside the city. And from overexhaustion and old age, he died that night. Okay, so I'll just finish the sutta, then I'll ask for questions. Okay, so after the king had left, then the Buddha addressed the monks, and he said, before he got up from his seat and left, King Pasenadi had uttered these statements, which now the Buddha is calling these Dhammacetiya. Do you know what the Chaitya? Chaitya is also what we call a stupa, or in Sri Lanka they call them Dagaba. It's like a memorial shrine. The Tibetans call them, what do they call them? Torten? Chorten. The Chinese, you call them Ta. Ta. They take different shapes. The ones in Sri Lanka usually shape something like this, with the spire on top. And there'll be a railing, or usually a railing around it. Like in Sri Lanka, every temple has one of the sort of necessities of a temple is the Dāgava, and then there are the famous big ones. In Anuradhapura, the great Dāgava, the great stupa, ruined Velisaya. Actually, there are 3 big ones in Anuradhapura. The Abhayagiri, Dāgava, and the Jetavana Dāgava, the 3 big ones. So the Buddha calls these sayings of the king monuments to the Dhamma, and then he urges the monks to learn those monuments to the Dhamma, and he says they're beneficial and belong to the fundamentals of the holy life. Okay, Katie, you had a question or a comment?
Sometimes the Buddha will say that someone died as an arahant.
Yeah.
Did he make any comment about the nature of King Pasenadi's mind? Seeing as he died shortly after this conversation, and also in a manner that surely would have been eye-opening. All of his symbols of sovereignty were gone. He had to walk on foot, and he died outside of a kingdom door. That's a pretty swift bookend to his life. But after coming from the Buddha, he may have also been able to see the illusoriness of a kingship as well as poverty or a namelessness at the end of his life, at the very end of his life, having no symbol on it. Yeah.
It would have been a good occasion for him, but to my recollection, there's no statement about the King Pasenadi having reached any attainment. And if one looks in the Samyutta Nikāya, where there's a chapter of short suttas spoken to King Pasenadi, one doesn't find what I would call a deep Dhamma teaching there. But mostly they're concerned with doing the discourses that the Buddha gives to the king, are mostly concerned with the inevitability of death, the inescapability of old age and death, the need to do deeds of merit. So apparently, and then there's no statement in the text, in any of the canonical texts, about King Pasenadi reaching any stage of equals Aryan attainment. So apparently he didn't reach, or at least I would assume he didn't reach such a stage. And maybe, in fact, there are some suttas that one finds where King Pasenadi is arranging, at least one sutta where he's arranging a great sacrifice with many animals to be killed, and another sutta where he says that the Buddha asked him what he's been doing. He hasn't seen him in some time, what he's been doing recently. And the king says, "Oh, I've been busy with the business of kings. Don't ask further about that." And then the commentary says that he's been launching wars and executing people. So it seems that despite his close relationship with the Buddha, the king didn't fully conform to the ways of virtue in his personal behavior. Yeah, I think there's also a story, it might be in a commentary, not in a sutta, where the king becomes impassioned with the wife of one of his lower order ministers. He falls in love with her. And so he transfers this minister to the army and sends him out in the forefront of a battle to get him killed so he can take over the minister's wife. So I think in his personal behavior, the king hadn't quite measured up to the full expectations of the Buddha. Did you have another?
Could you speak it up to the role of deer? This is a very broad question, but a good mind here is compared to the mind of a wild deer, is that correct? And then we look at the one of the previous lives of the Buddha as the banyan deer. And it's looking in the, even though this is an animal, and
looking into what?
Looking at the structure of samsara, even though this is in the animal realm, it seems to me the deer is often. I'm asking you actually, can you speak about the role of the deer in this? And here we have a very high, that's a pretty high comment to say, to make the mind like a wild deer. Do you have any thoughts about?
I think maybe two things could be implied by this. One is that a deer is a very gentle animal, or at least the way we observe the deers from direct observation. They seem to be very gentle, quite peaceful in their style of life. So maybe it means that the mind is very gentle, very peaceful. And also I think there's an assumption that the deer is able to wander wherever it wants. It's not tied down by a fixed home. And so the monks who are leading the monastic life are able to wander wherever they want. They're not tied down to a fixed residence. It's also maybe significant that the Buddha gave his first discourse in the deer park at near Benares. And then, as you mentioned, that he was reported to be the deer king in previous life, maybe several previous lives.
So one thing that occurs to me, I'm wondering about Pasenadi's idealization of the Buddha's community. Yes. And that the Buddha, instead of correcting him, lets it stand. And actually says it's a monument to the Dhamma. Yeah,
that's an interesting point.
I'm wondering whether you have a thought about that.
It raises questions about whether some of the words of praise that the king uses in regard to the Buddha and the Sangha are stock formulations that we find elsewhere in the text. So part of this could have been standard formulations that the monks had composed about themselves or about the Buddha, and which here they are putting in the mouth of the king as a way of showing that their own composed statements have the seal of royalty, the approval of royalty.
So are you thinking then that this sutta is something added after?
I wouldn't say that it's added after. It could be that the king really did utter words of praise of the Buddha, but the actual words that were used could have been amplified by taking these stock formulations and then ascribing them to the king. It's a very difficult issue to go through the text and say what is coming from directly from the Buddha's mouth and what is part of the formulation that has been established after the Buddha's passing and then ascribed to him. Since we have versions of the sutta in parallels in the other Buddhist schools, obviously it goes back to the time before, I think, even the first division within the Sangha. But that doesn't rule out the possibility that parts of it were composed at the council, and then the fact that there are some minor differences in the versions in the different schools indicates that the sutta didn't reach its final form until sometime after the schools separated, or else that there were lapses in memory and attempts to reconstruct details of the suttas in some of the schools.
So with the incident at Kasami would have obviously happened years before. If this is something that the Buddha's 18.
Oh, no, that would have happened, I don't know what the year was, but it would have been probably someplace in the middle of the Buddha's, I think probably in an fairly early period, because the Buddha leaves Kosambi in Sutta 128 and he goes to visit a group of monks. Amongst them is Anuruddha, who is a cousin of the Buddha. And Anuruddha later became like one of the great disciples, the one who is foremost in the divine eye. And at that point, where the Buddha visits them, Anuruddha and the other two monks, his companions, have not yet reached arhatship. So it's still in a relatively early period of the formation of the Sangha.
I take monuments to the Dhamma. The Dhamma means the Buddha's teaching, right?
Yeah, I would think.
And how about the king say, I infer according to Dhamma?
Yeah, this is actually, I don't know if that's such a good translation now. It's, I think in Pali, it's Dhammanvaye or Dhammanvayena. I think it could well be an idiomatic expression meaning something like, I infer with good grounds, or I infer justifiably. Or I infer reasonably, rightly. Well, sometimes the way the word Dhamma is used in relation to reasoning, it doesn't mean so much the Buddha's teaching, but it means what is right, what is proper, what is reasonable.
And this is translating monuments of the Dharma here, or what was the...
No, she's asking about this expression we get where the king says, I infer according to Dhamma.
I think in your explanation, you said qualities. I mean, when you were explaining this sentence before, you said according to the qualities. Could Dhamma be rendered as qualities?
I'm not I don't think that would work here. I think sometimes in contexts like this, the commentary glosses the word Dhamma with karana, with the long A, which means reason, cause. So it seems that is the sense, or that's the way I would take it. Okay, any other questions? Okay, I think we'll have to take a break here and we go for lunch. Then I think we'll have to meet back here. Actually, they're finished with the retreat. But I'm not sure whether they might not have the room set up. So we can meet back here after lunch, say 12:15, just for a little short discussion if anybody has any more questions. Okay, we'll end with the sharing. And we'll have the class, let's see, today is 1st, 8th. Next week we'll do Sutta number 91. Yeah, I just want to occur to me some points relating to what Gina brought up about what I would call stock passages in the text. Like we get this long statement about how different debaters came to the Buddha and tried to, with the intention of refuting him and embarrassing him, and then they became swayed over by the Buddha. We get the same exact thing in Sutta number 27 in the Majjhima Nikāya. The beginning part of Sutta number 27. And then we get this passage about how disciples don't interrupt the Buddha when he's teaching. We find that passage almost, I think it's verbatim in Sutta number, again it's number 77. And so, it's very unlikely that, in the case of number 77, that the wanderer Sakrawadayi and King Pasenadi of Kosala just happened to hit on exactly the same words.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll share the merits with the Dhamma protecting Devas, the fair spirits, the Buddhas, the Nagas, asking them to be well and happy and free from all harm and suffering. Akasata chabumata deva nagamhedika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu sasanam. Akasata chabumata deva nagamhedika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu desanam. Akasata chabumata deva nagamhedika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu mang param. Etavata hehi sampadam punya sampadam sabbe devanumodantu. Short way, sabbe bhutanumodantu, sabbe satanumodantu, sabba sampati siddhya, pavagupadaya avijihetato, etantare satakayupapanna, rupya rupicha sanya sanyino, dukkha pamuchantu, pusantu nibuting. Okay, then we end with the 3 vows to the Buddha. Or 3 half vows.
Out of Bombay.